The title of this talk is Scientific Pointers to God. And in the next slide, I'm going to tell you what I mean by a pointer. Next slide. Okay, what is a pointer? It's a kind of evidence, actually. But it's a term that's often used by people in the science and faith community to refer to the kind of evidence that we talk about when we're talking about evidence for God in a scientific context. So in general, in science, what you see is that pathway here. We start with a hypothesis, we do experiments, those experiments lead to things we call facts, and that, if you get enough facts that all fit together, you can form a theory. And if you're lucky, you can make a law from that theory using mathematics. But not every theory is amenable to mathematics. One theory that is not, for example, is evolution. On the other hand, gravity, the theory of gravity, has several mathematical laws that are part of it. Click, next. So what are pointers? There are various kinds of pointers. They include, well, not yet, hold on. Back. Facts, ideas, signs, missing information. All of these are just things that occur to people when they're trying to understand reality, nature. And all of those things, click, we have some animation here. All of those things are pointers that point to a hypothesis. Okay, so the whole idea of science is you have to start with a hypothesis, an idea, a guess. Maybe such and such is due to such and such. Okay, but how do you get there? How do you get that? And you get that from these ideas and these signs and things that just you don't know, missing information. Now we'll go to the next slide. So here are some examples of pointers that occur in the scientific world. In this case, it's how do we know that proteins are genes? Now, they're not, okay? But until the 1940s, everybody assumed that proteins were genes, or that genes were proteins, were made out of protein, okay? It turned out not to be true. But that's what everybody thought. And the reason was that everything else was a protein, okay? All the enzymes, all the materials of the cells were proteins, so why not genes also? But there was some missing information because it turned out that no proteins were found to actually have any inheritory activity. And there was also some evidence that nucleic acids were the transforming principle in bacteria. I won't go into detail on that. What happened? Okay. The missing information was nobody knew what DNA was. And however, because of all of that, all of those pointers, we ended up with a hypothesis that maybe DNA is the genetic material and that solving its structure might help determine if that's true or not. Now, what's interesting here is, I don't know if you've ever heard the idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Has anyone heard that? It's a common thing you'll hear from atheists who say that God is an extraordinary claim and therefore it requires extraordinary evidence. And there is not extraordinary evidence for God. Why is that wrong? Because there's no such thing as an extraordinary evidence. You will never find, just like you'll never find proof, you'll never find the words extraordinary evidence in a scientific paper. In science, we have weak evidence and we have strong evidence. That's it. There's nothing else. There's no extraordinary evidence. The idea that DNA is what makes up the genes, that genes are made of these polynucleotides, had very weak evidence until 1953, when Watson and Crick discovered something called base pairing, and the sequence of bases in the DNA is very important. And that became strong evidence. It was not extraordinary at all. There's no such thing. So what we need for God is not extraordinary evidence. We just need regular strong evidence like everything else. Okay, so next time you hear that, or if you haven't heard it yet, the first time you hear that, remember what I'm telling you. Nonsense. Next slide. Well, what about scientific pointers? Well, there's something instead of nothing. That's a fact. And that needs an explanation. Why is there something? Why is there anything? Okay, and not how, but why. And also how. How did the universe start? Why are we here? Why is there planets? I mean, that's a fact. Here is an important pointer, the second one. The universe seems to be fine-tuned to allow for life. Now, what does that mean? All the laws of science, all the physical laws of science, include numbers, constant values of things, which determine how the law operates. And if those numbers were tiny, tiny bit different, the universe would not be here. It might be just made out of hydrogen atoms. It might be gravity, it would be so strong that everything would just crunch together. Everything has to be perfectly set in many, many different laws, in many, many different equations. How did that happen? This has been called the most important and most convincing piece of evidence for God by atheists have said that. Smart atheists have said that. Because there's no other answer. There's no actual scientific answer for the fine-tuning of the natural constants. So it's a good piece of evidence. It's strong evidence for God. Scientific evidence. Now, the next one is interesting because we know that all the laws of science can be expressed mathematically and very simply. You may have all heard of E equals mc squared. That's an equation. And it only has a few terms. E, the amount of energy, is equal to the mass. So the amount of energy that's hidden in this stool is equal to its mass times a huge number, the speed of light squared. I don't even know what that number is. It's gigantic. That means if this was all turned into energy, it would be an atomic bomb, literally. This is about the size of an atomic bomb. Luckily, we can't do that very easily. But if we could, that's how much energy we release. But the question is, why is it so easy to make a mathematical law to express such complicated things as energy and mass, and they're related to each other with a simple constant, the square of the speed of light? And this happens in almost all natural laws. Newton's law of gravity. The force is equal to a constant, again, a fine-tuned constant, times the weight of the two masses that are, attracting each other, divided by their distance squared. Very simple. And a very famous physicist named Eugene Wigner wrote a very famous paper called The Improbable Effectiveness of Mathematics. In other words, what he was saying is, it doesn't make sense that mathematics, we made up mathematics, humans, okay? We made it up. And it works. It works beautifully to explain the laws of nature. That's something weird here. And many scientists, many physicists have said this starts to look like maybe God is involved. What's next? Well, there's this question of morality, and that's, of course, a huge topic worthy of several different seminars. But it relates to what I was just talking about with Brandon. Why are people good at all? And not just good, but why do people sacrifice their lives for others? The stories are endless. Just think of any experience you've heard about. people in war, people in tragic situations and catastrophes and disasters, the things they will do to save their fellow man who they may not even know. They don't know who those people are. They'll dive in the river. They'll take risks on their own lives. That's not evolution, folks. That's the opposite. That's not natural selection. Natural selection says save yourself. Don't worry about the other guy. And the just so story is, well, you know, we're selected to take care of our kinfolk, okay, of our relatives, because, you know, our relatives have the same genes that we have. Yeah, but when people dive into water to save a drowning person, they don't know that person. It's not a relative. So then you have a just so story, which you can ignore. So that's another one. Okay, there's a lot of missing information, which we'll get to. Next slide. Okay, here's a key point that I want to make. When you say something like, we don't know the origin of life, how it could have occurred, which I say all the time, or we don't know what dark matter is, or we don't know, whatever it is that we don't know how the brain works, an atheist will say, oh, so you're saying if we don't know, then you're saying God did it. That's called the God of the gaps. And the God of the gaps means if there's a gap in our knowledge, you fill it with God. But the problem with that, and this was first identified by a theologian correctly, the problem with that idea is if you say that every time that science doesn't know something, quote, yet, you say, well, it must be evidence for God, then what happens when further science finds the answer? What happens to your view of God? Does it go down? Is it diminished? And that's a legitimate point. But the point that I want to make is, I'm not talking about believing in God because of the gaps. I'm talking not about why we think God is there, not because of what we don't know. I'm talking about the science that we do know that tells us that God is there. And there is such, and I'm going to show you some of it. Next. Okay, this is just an animation. We can go to the next slide. Okay. Before I show that, this is a little bit philosophical. You can ignore it if you don't like the terms. But there are two kinds of unknowns. When we say we don't know something, sometimes it's because, well, we just don't have enough information. All right? So people didn't used to know what thunder was. They thought it was God's bowling or whatever. And you'll always hear that one, by the way. Now we know that thunder is caused by meteorological stuff. Yeah, okay. Nobody in religion has ever said that God is involved in thunder. But anyway, that's the example that they love to bring. And those are called epistemic gaps. Those are missing knowledge. And that's the kind of gap that is not very useful to put God into, because eventually it may get filled. But that's not the only kind of knowledge we don't have. There are some things that we scientifically know cannot be known. In other words, there are things that we cannot know. And I'll show you what I mean. One of the most famous ones, next slide, is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is a foundational part of quantum mechanics. It's the basis for how your cell phones work. So it's true. And what that principle says is that we can never, and it doesn't mean we need more research, we need to find out more. No. The fundamental nature of the universe is such that we cannot know the position and the momentum of an electron at the same time. It's uncertain by definition, and it will never be certain. That's what I call an ontological gap. That's a piece of knowledge that we cannot find out. Now, how does that point to God? Well, this Heisenberg uncertainty principle is part of physical reality, which was created by God. Okay, so God is involved in telling us what we can't know. And if we read the Bible, especially the book of Job, which is one of my favorite books, by the way, you know, how did God answer Job at the end of that book? Where were you? Can you do what I did? You human? Can you make a world the way I made a world? No. Why are you arguing with me? Why are you raising up all these issues with me? I'm the creator of the universe. I am God. You're Job. You're a good guy, but you're not me. And we're all in that position. Right? So, let's go on. Next. Another thing which is very interesting is you cannot measure the length of the coastline of Great Britain or of Maine. I happen to know Maine better. You can't measure it because if you try measuring it, it depends on the size of your ruler because the coastline is what we call a fractal. It has the same degree of complexity at every scale. If you look at the coast of England from an airplane, it looks very irregular. If you get down closer, it looks very irregular. If you go all the way down and stand at the shore and look down, it has the same degree of irregularity. That's called a fractal. And that fractal structure is present throughout the natural world. Leaves show it. Lungs have it. It's common everywhere. That's how God created the world. We can't measure the coastline. We need a ruler that's like an atom long to see how many atoms length there is in each rock. And we can't do it. Next. I think we'll skip this. This is an example. Well, it might be interesting. This is an example of what we can't know. Even in mathematics, mathematics is a pure thing, right? Well, it turns out Gödel, who was a brilliant mathematician in the 30s and 40s, came up with the theorems that said, and you can read it, any logical system is either incomplete or contradictory. And one example is kind of silly is this sentence is false. Think about that. If it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's true. Okay? So that's not really Gödel's theorem, but it kind of illustrates the idea that either if you have a logical system, it's not going to be, and that includes arithmetic, by the way. Sorry to tell the students here. But arithmetic, 2 plus 2 is 4, etc., very nice. But there are things in arithmetic that are either contradictory or cannot be proven. So even math. Next. All right, let's see. It's hard for me to look up. Well, you can read that slide. Basically, the early scientists all were convinced that the natural world and the laws of it were all derived from God. I think that's an important statement because it goes along with the idea that science and God were never in conflict, as I said earlier during the interview, were never in conflict up until very recently. Next, please. Okay, so let's get to biology, which is really what I really want to talk about. And I mentioned briefly that biologists tend to be, there are more atheists among biologists than any other science. And it's very interesting because originally biology was not considered a science. It was considered part of metaphysics. And the reason for that was people, I believe correctly, inferred that you can't make a science out of biology because it's so complicated. I mean, how do you make a science out of all the things we do and even animals and plants? It was beyond them. It wasn't like physics where you can just, drop a ball or you can roll something up a plane or whatever. It was complicated. It was difficult. And, oh, this is great. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Yeah. I appreciate that. Thanks very much. Yeah, that's good. Okay, thanks. I can even swivel, so that's good. So when biology started to become a science in the 19th century, biologists were very concerned that other scientists treat them as equals. The chemists and the physicists, and they still do, by the way, will sneer at biology as being, less than a real physical science. So they ruled out anything that could smack of philosophy or metaphysics or, heaven forbid, theology, right? Nothing like that was allowed in biology. And the reaction is extreme. I could tell stories about things that have happened where somebody, says something or writes something that sounds a little metaphysical and it gets pounded on. And so lots of ideas were eliminated from the academic world of biology. And that includes things like teleology, which means purpose, even agency, which means things that do things. Because in physics, things happen without any purpose, okay? You get a volcano, it's just because of natural forces. Nobody said, hey, I think I'll be a volcano and blow up, or I think there's a reason for me. I want to have an earthquake because I want to do something. No, they just happen. That's true in physics. It's true in chemistry. It's not true in biology, right? Just think about it. Look at a fox. He's running. Why? Well, there's a rabbit over there. He wants to catch the rabbit. The rabbit's running too. Why? He doesn't want to get eaten. There's purpose in everything that every living organism does, including bacteria. And they have agency. They're able to act. They have free will. They can run or they cannot run. They can decide it's not worth it. That's biological. But we're not allowed to talk about that in biological papers. It's forbidden. The paper won't get published. Now, I've done a lot of writing about this, and it's actually beginning to change. There are some biologists, very good ones, who are not even theists, who are saying, we got to bring that back. I mean, we threw out the baby with the bathwater. I mean, you got to bring teleology back into biological science. We'll see what happens. Next slide. Okay. I think I've already mentioned a lot of this. So these are some examples of atheistic views. I call them religious views because that kind of atheism is really religious. It's not, in a way, which is another discussion. But the point is that you will often hear these statements from atheists explaining or talking about how you don't need anything other than modern chemistry and physics to explain things in biology. Consciousness, for example, is one. Well, that's all neural chemistry. It's not. And everybody knows it's not. And nobody knows what it is. Okay. So if your student, the question that Brandon asked me before, if your student comes back and says something like one of these, which they heard from a professor or a teacher or a classmate, no, that's wrong. This is not science. This is a philosophical ideology. Next. Okay, I want to talk about design. Now, you can't deny that there's design in biology. Just look at some of these photos. These are animals and birds, and of course, the most wonderful example of design in the biological world is a human being. And I happen to choose a photograph of the most wonderful person in the universe, who is with us and is going to kill me when I walk out of here. Anyway, so design is undeniable. Okay, we know that. Now, where is the origin of design? Next slide. Three possible choices. Most biologists, and that includes the 90% who are atheists, will say, well, yeah, in fact, Dawkins has written about this a lot, Richard Dawkins. There's the appearance of design. It's not real, it's apparent, and it comes from evolution. Okay, and that, he makes a good argument for that, but how far does it go? And that's a question which is very complicated, I won't get into. I obviously believe that, yes, there is some design that comes directly from the forces of evolution, but not all of it. Another way of looking at it is that there's an intelligent agent, and you've all heard of intelligent design, which is an interesting idea, and that is that there's an intelligent agent. Originally, they would say they don't know what it is. It could be God, but it could be anything else, and that's a reasonable way to look at things. Right now, with Steve Meyer's newest book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, he's saying, well, yeah, it's God, which we already knew. But what I like to say is that design definitely comes from God in the initial creation, and that includes evolution. To me, and this is not a very common view, but my view is that the parts of evolution that work are part of God's creation. Exactly. Exactly. Glory to God for all of his natural laws. Gravity, the strong force, the weak force, the electromagnetic force, and any other forces like the biological forces, which we don't know yet. But one of them might be evolution, which works to some extent. And so I don't consider evolution to be antithetical to God or even to the Bible, but that's a whole other lecture, which maybe next time, but not now. All right, so those are the three choices. Next slide. Okay, so what am I doing? Am I just talking, or do I actually do science? And the answer is I actually do some science, even in my retired state. I don't have a lab, but it's theoretical. And what I'm interested in is the question of self-replication. And the reason I'm interested in that is because self-replication is a purely biological phenomenon. Nothing else makes copies of itself. Nothing else makes accurate copies of itself, and that's very important, as we'll see. Next. So, what do I mean by that? Let's say you go and you see a house, you love the house, and you say, I want that. I want the exact copy of that house. You go to a contractor, you say, make me a copy of that house. I want it exactly the way this is, everything about it, the plumbing, the electrical, the structure, and, next click, everything inside it. I want the same furniture, I want the same books, the same pictures, everything, identical. Can you do that? Yeah. It won't be cheap. Okay, that contractor's got to do a lot of work and get a lot of subcontractors to get the same paintings, the same books, everything the same. But they could do it. But suppose you went to that house and you said, house, make another one just like yourself. Can you imagine a house being able to do that? A factory? Anything? Nothing else reproduces itself completely accurately other than a living cell. Next. There's a cell. Click. It makes two copies of itself. Click. Which are 99.9999% identical. That's amazing because there's more stuff in a cell than there is in 1,000 houses. There are millions of molecules in a cell. Millions of proteins, 5,000 different varieties of proteins. The number of components of a cell is staggering, a single cell. And that cell, every 20 minutes, well, depending on the kind of cell, maybe every hour, makes two copies of itself perfectly accurately. And why does it have to be so accurate? Well, evolution requires that. Next. And I'm going to tell you about that. I don't have a slide for it. But the reason evolution requires it is, let's say you have a bird, this is according to standard evolutionary theory, that has a mutation somewhere in its genes, and now it has better eyesight. It can see better, okay? So it's going to do great. It's going to catch more food. It's going to have a better chance of survival. It's going to have more babies. That's called natural selection. But what if that bird's babies did not inherit that mutation? They're just like all the other birds. The first bird, the one that could see gray, dies, and that's the end of the story. To have evolution, evolution goes on through generations. But by definition, it requires inheritance. Even Darwin knew that. He didn't know what inheritance was, chemically, but he knew it existed. So if you don't have accurate inheritance, if you don't have accurate replication, you get no evolution. Now, this is very profound, because if you need accurate replication in order to get evolution, it couldn't have happened by evolution, right? That would be a circular reasoning. So which came first? Well, we don't know. But I'm going to show you later, if you think that accurate inheritance can just happen, wait till you see the last few slides. You will be convinced that's not possible. Let's see, I think we may skip a couple next. This is the genetic code. I'm not going to say much about it. It's really important in replication. It's what decides how replication happens. You'll learn this, hopefully, once you change your majors to biology. You'll learn all about it. And it's amazing. It's amazing. And by the way, don't ever let anyone tell you it's not really a code. This has become a common meme among ignorant atheists, not scientific atheists. They all know it's a code, but somehow or other it got spread. And I keep telling atheists, look, you're shooting yourself in the foot. Don't say this. It's a code. It's a real code, symbolic and everything else. Next. And here's how that well, you know what? We're going to skip these. Let's skip the next two. Too much chemistry here. We don't need that. Okay. I should say what this is. Okay. So the genetic code is a code because it uses symbolic information. And the symbols have to do with the chemical identities of the nucleotides that are in the DNA. That's very technical. But the point is, it is the first kind of symbolic information that ever existed. What's an example of other symbolic information that we use all the time, that I'm using right now? Language. Sure. I'm saying sounds, okay? I'm saying this water is good, but water, that doesn't say anything about what water looks like. It's a wet liquid. I should be saying this is a wet liquid, but that doesn't make sense either. Liquid? So in other words, language is symbolic information, both spoken and written. Okay? A tree is the same thing as an albero. Albero is the Italian for tree, but if you didn't know Italian, you wouldn't know it was just a sound. So in other words, symbolic information, language, is coded, and you have to know the code. You have to speak the language in order to understand what is meant. That's how the genetic code works. There's a system in there, and I'm going to show it to you very quickly. And again, I said, you don't have to understand it, you just have to be overawed by it. And that's how the genetic code works. It's symbolic information. And what else produces symbolic information besides life? Answer, click. Nothing. None. There's no other system that produces in the natural world. Now, you'll hear people say, oh, there's information everywhere. No, that's a different definition of information. The kind of information I'm talking about, the language type coded information, is only in life. We are living beings. That's why we do it. And bees, have information. Animals have, communicate. But they're all life. Okay? No rock, no volcano, no storm conveys symbolic information. That's very important. Next. Okay, let's see. I'm going to have to go back here for a second. Okay, let's click through this. These are some of the other systems, in addition to the genetic code and replication, that are incredibly complex and that are all required for this accurate inheritance. Okay, protein synthesis, error correction systems, the regulation of genes. All of these, I'm just giving you words and names. I can't go into detail on all of them, but there are many systems in biology that are in the same position of being required before you can have evolution start. Next. We don't know the origins of any of those systems. We don't know how they began. And that's one of the reasons that the origin of life is such a mystery. It's because all the systems that are required to have the first living cell, we don't know how any of them could have gotten started. Not one. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of James Tour. He's a chemist who talks about the problems with understanding the chemistry of how the early parts of life could have begun, proteins, nucleotides, lipids. But I echo his comments with respect to what happens later, after you even get those things, which is difficult. Even then, you still have the problem. We don't have a clue how any of these systems could have developed. Next. Okay. I'm now going to, this is a video. I'm going to try to talk through it. I'm going to go very fast. And what I want you to, this is kind of an exercise in Zen here. Don't try to follow the meaning. Just look at this and think, whoa. Okay? There's a couple of videos. I hope they're all working. We'll see. Okay, so how does the genetic code work? You see that blue thing, that's an enzyme. It's made out of protein. It's a chemical. It's not conscious, but it has some amazing functions. And you only see things like this in life. This enzyme is called alanine tRNA synthetase. Won't be on the test. Its job is to put two different molecules together. One of them is an amino acid. Amino acids are what make proteins. Proteins are long chains of amino acids. It binds a particular amino acid. In this case, it's called alanine, and it also binds something called a transfer RNA, which is a different kind of chemical. It's made out of RNA, and it has a nucleotide sequence, which is called an anticodon. This one is called GCA. Let's click and start the video. First thing that happens is the alanine binds to a specific binding site that is specific for alanine. And at the same time, a different part of the protein binds the tRNA that goes with alanine, and they form a bond. But something else happens before, and that is the alanine is shifted to another site on the enzyme where it doesn't fit. And the reason that site is there is if you have the wrong amino acid, here's another one called glycine, that one will also go into this other site, and it fits perfectly and is destroyed. That's how this enzyme makes sure it has the right amino acid and not the wrong one. So it made this alanine tRNA complex, which then goes and binds, because of this very specific base pairing, between the anticodon and a codon, which comes from the DNA, that's on something called the messenger RNA. I think you have to click again. Okay. So what happens next is you have all these amino acids stuck to tRNAs, transfer RNAs, and they go to something called the ribosome, which is that round circle, in which there is a tape which comes from the nucleus where the DNA is. And that tape, which is RNA, has anticodons that match the codons on the tRNAs. The first amino acid, which in this case is methionine, goes to the first site in the ribosome, and then the second one comes and goes to the second site. This one is glycine. And notice that they have different codons. Those are the letters on the top. Different anticodons on the top, which match the codons on the messenger RNA. What happens next is that there is a bond formed between the two amino acids. Should be moving. There it is. There's the bond. Okay. And when that happens, the ribosome actually physically moves along the tape. And now the methionine is no longer bound to its tRNA. That goes away. And we just have two amino acids bound to each other. Now, the third amino acid comes. This one is valine. And it also has an anticodon which matches its codon. And a bond is formed between the glycine and the valine. And the tRNA goes away as the ribosome moves again, another 3 bases away. And that tRNA goes away also. And eventually the fourth amino acid will come in. And eventually you get a long chain of amino acids making a protein. Whew. That protein then folds, and here are some actual pictures of actual folded proteins, and here's the video that shows how this happens in real time. The green things are the tRNAs attached to amino acids. The yellow tape is the messenger RNA containing the codons. The blue is the ribosome, and that red thing coming out at the top is the growing protein chain. And there they go. And this is slowed down several thousand-fold, by the way. So, what's happening here is we're making a protein, one amino acid at a time. The details, of course, are beyond comprehension. Here comes the protein coming out of the ribosome. Notice that it comes out as a line, and it quickly folds up into a shape, because proteins, as I said, as you saw before, have shapes. And so this keeps folding and making a shape until finally it's done, and out it goes, and it's an enzyme that will then help catalyze the process of life. And that's how the genetic code works. And that is the system that has to be in place before you can have life or evolution or anything else. Now, do you think that could have happened by chance? Not a chance. Not a chance. It had to evolve, but if it evolved, we don't know what that means. Because you can't get evolution without this. Because if you don't have this accuracy, you can't get evolution for the reason I said. It's going to get lost. So even if this thing happened by chance once, it'll never happen again. Okay? So there's my argument for something other than strictly the laws of chemistry and physics for explaining the origin of life. I have a much better explanation. You know what that is. The origin of life, life itself, is a miracle from God. I want to know how he did it. It's not enough for me to say that. I'm a scientist. I want to know how he did it. But I'll tell you that when I find out, and I probably won't, but when someone finds out, it's going to point straight to God. It's going to point to the Creator, as all of the rest of our science does. Hallelujah. Amen. All right.